All right, so we're now on the Facebook part as well as the study here with each other. Tonight we're going to be studying Paul's letter to Timothy, the second letter. And the text we're in is in chapter 3, verses 1 to 9 of Paul's second letter to Timothy. In chapter 2, we had already seen there's a high standard of care and of help that Timothy is to engage in as the Lord's bondservant. In chapter 2, he was not to be quarrelsome, but kind to all. And we're going to see tonight in chapter 3 why that might get especially difficult. Not be quarrelsome, kind to all, able to teach, patient when wronged, with gentleness correcting those in opposition, if perhaps God might grant them repentance, leading to the knowledge of the truth. And they may come to their senses and escape the snare of the devil, having been held captive by him to do his will. So that's the context of the end of chapter 2. And now we see why we're going to need that kindness, and why that not quarrelsomeness and patience might very well be tested. So 2 Timothy 3, verse 1, and reading on. But realize this, that in the last days, difficult times will come. For men will be lovers of self, lovers of money, boastful, arrogant, revilers, disobedient to parents, ungrateful, unholy, unloving, irreconcilable, malicious gossips, without self-control, brutal, haters of good, treacherous, reckless, conceited, lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God, holding to a form of godliness, although they've denied its power. Avoid such men as these. For among them are those who enter into households and captivate weak women, weighed down with sins, led on by various impulses, always learning and never able to come to the knowledge of the truth. Just as Jannes and Jambres opposed Moses, so these men also opposed the truth, men of depraved mind, rejected in regard to faith. But they will not make further progress, for their folly will be obvious to all, just as Jannes and Jambres' folly was also. So here we have these perilous times, difficult times going to come in the last days. So in the last days, these things will come. So Timothy, have a strong realization that it won't all be smooth and easy sailing. There are going to be problems. And it says that in the last days, these things will come. Well, there's a lot of misunderstanding about the last days. And honestly, in this usage of the last days, and some of it I don't fully understand. I do understand that there's going to be lots of problems. And there's going to be people who do all of these things. And these things that these folks do are an awful lot like the things of Romans chapter 1. The last days that Timothy faces are going to look an awful lot like the pagan days of Romans chapter 1. And so here comes a long list of things that you're going to run into. And we run into the same things yet and still. Now, when it comes to the last days part, there's some who say because people are as they are, because so much of this list seems to be prophetic of our own time, people say, see, we're in the last days, or we're just about to enter the last days. I don't think that's quite what is meant here, because if you go back to the prophecy of Joel of what will come in the last days, the pouring forth of the Spirit of God upon all mankind, the young men and young women having dreams and prophesying. Well, Peter said in Acts 2 that was coming true as he spoke. And so Peter's sermon of Acts 2, quoting Joel, was in the last days. And then in the book of Hebrews, the Hebrew writer gives us in Hebrews 1, in these last days, after God spoke in the past times and various ways and manners through prophets and dreams and all the such. Now in these last days, he's spoken to us through his beloved Son. And so the time of Jesus speaking to us is the last days. Well, here's the last days. Again, the last days coming of all of this error and all of this evil. And so I think Timothy saw these in his day, and Timothy was in the last days. So Jesus was in the last days, Peter was in the last days, Timothy was in the last days, and guess what? We're in the same time frame that they are, 2 millennia on, but we're still in the same time frame. We're in the age of the revelation of the Messiah. We're in the age of the kingdom. I believe we're still in the last days. I don't think there's anything about the evil of mankind today that says we're in a new phase of last days. We're in the last of the last days. We're in the laster days, or anything like that. And so, yes, we're in these last days. And in this time of the Messiah, these last days, these perilous, these difficult times will come. And so, as I said, what strikes me about this is not the last days part, but the instruction that this will come. As I said, this looks an awful lot like Romans 1. It looks a lot like what already has been here in these last days. In Romans 1, they didn't see fit, Romans 1:28. They didn't see fit to acknowledge God any longer. God gave them over to a depraved mind to do the things which are not proper, being filled with all unrighteousness, wickedness, greed, evil, full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, malice, gossip, slanderers, haters of God, insolent, arrogant, boastful, inventors of evil, disobedient to parents, without understanding, untrustworthy, unloving, unmerciful. Yeah, that's what they were. Paul says, you know what? Now the Messiah is here. Guess what? They will be yet again. So the part that most confuses me about this is that in the last days, men will be this. They were this way before the last days. But there's something that Paul is trying to convey to Timothy, that just because I think this is why it's set in the future, in the will be, is that don't think that because the Messiah has come, things like this disappear. You will have this now in the church. Of course, I think they probably had this in synagogues all along. Read the Gospels and what Jesus encountered in the synagogues. And so often it was the same thing. And so now, Timothy, you'll face it too. And even in the age of the Messiah, even in the time when we have realized the hope that God has been preparing people for so long, even though that hope has come, the hearts of men in so many ways are the same. And so, as I said, it looks like a Romans 1 world in here in 2 Timothy chapter 3. And the sad thing is, maybe the shocking thing of it is, this Romans 1 world seems to have invaded the church. And so Timothy's going to have to deal with these things. Well, what's the list? Men will be lovers of self. I can't imagine. This again is where we think, well, Paul must be talking about our own time, when everybody gets self-realized and self-actualized and everybody's self-esteem is pumped up higher than the ceiling, even though their own, their actions are lowest of the low, but they still love each other. They still love themselves more than they love each other. We have to be talking about prophecy, right? Well, not necessarily. Men have been this way from all time. The great call of the gospel is, if you want to follow him, you have to deny yourself, take up your cross, and follow. Jesus has always told us, he who wishes to exalt himself shall be humbled. But I like to exalt myself. It's one of my favorite activities. One of the few things I'm probably pretty good at. No, don't love yourself. Love the Lord. But in departure from truth, men love themselves. They also love money. They're lovers of money. King James will tell us they were covetous. They're greedy. Paul tells us that amounts to idolatry. It's tantamount to idolatry. Paul had said in the first letter that those who want to get rich fall to temptation and snare, many foolish and harmful desires, plunging them to ruin and destruction, and that the love of money is the root of all kinds of evil. And yet people love money, so they get into all kinds of evil. They're then boastful. They put themselves forward. They talk about what they will do or would have done I think that may be the worst kind of boasting of all. There's a blowhard who's always telling us what he's done, and we often kind of tune him out. But there's another kind of blowhard and boastful. He tells us what you should have done and what he would have done. And with all the coulda, woulda, shouldas. And so there's too much emphasis, again, on self, the story that's always about self. With this goes arrogance. King James, proud. They are proud. We know that goes before a fall. That's why it's so dangerous. We know that God is opposed to the proud, but he gives grace to the humble. But still, they're proud. They speak out about everybody and everything. They're revilers. The King James says that they're blasphemers. Generally, when we have reviling, we're talking evil about other people. And when we have blasphemers in translations, it means speaking out evil against God. It's one of those things that's contextually determined which one of these it should be. And so some translations take it that these are speaking out against God. Some take it they're speaking out against people. It's the same word, to be the same expression in Greek. In English, we divide it into two parts. And so the reviling here, or the blaspheming, is this that these boastful and arrogant people do, these ones who love themselves so much? Do you think they're speaking more about other people in an evil way, or more about God in an evil way? Well, that would determine how you take and translate even this word, the reviling or the blaspheming. I think they're probably pretty equal opportunity offenders. They've never learned respectfulness. They've never learned the kind of self-control they ought, because we see the next thing is we see that they are disobedient to parents. They're disobedient to parents. For the entirety of my life, I remember the preachers talking about how this latest generation is disobedient to parents, the likes of which they've never seen. And so if the old men who said that when I was a kid, if they could see us now, I wonder now what they'd say. Maybe they'd say, well, now I've seen worse. But in any case, we have, it seems like a constant battle with that. And if one doesn't learn to be respectful to the first authority, an authority that without doubt brought you into this world, right? We all remember the old Bill Cosby routine, although maybe I shouldn't speak in any way about Bill Cosby, knowing his end, but the old, I brought you into this world, I can take you out. But the people who we know brought us into this world, the people for whom we know that we were entirely dependent upon them to feed and house and clothe and bathe and change us, if we can't be respectful to those folks, how are we going to be respectful to any other more abstract authority? And so what do we have as far as problems at the schools? What do we have as far as problems in the community? And so disobedient to parents, the first line of both civil and religious authority, these people are disrespectful to. And when they get to the second and third lines of civil and religious authority, well, they're not going to be any better. These, you think, well, how ungrateful? Yes, that's the next word here. They're ungrateful. The King James gives us that they are unthankful. So they don't return thanks. Remember again, the commonality between here and Romans 1. In Romans 1, the Romans 1 world started because people did not see fit to acknowledge or give thanks to God. When there was no acknowledgement of God, when there was no gratitude to God, the rest of the Roman 1 world just seemed to follow as a natural course. It might well be that ingratitude might be one of the first cars in the train, might be one of the engines that pull the whole thing along. And the thing about gratitude is you are acknowledging some dependence. You're acknowledging some help. You give thanks to people. You're grateful to people when you recognize in the ways in which they've helped you. Well, what if you think you're on your own? You've done it all yourself. You didn't need any help. You didn't want their help anyway. I know I got their help, but I didn't want it. I didn't need it. And so this lack of respect, this denial of dependence, a denial of interconnectivity with other people. And so here we have this list. We are well into a Romans 1 world, but Timothy's evidently going to have to deal with this in the church. Well, now they're unholy. They are unholy. What's the whole thing about the church to be, right? This is to be a sanctification or holiness, being brought in as God's people to do God's will, to bring God glory. These people are at absolute odds with that. There's a sanctification, Hebrews 12:14, without which no one will see the Lord. These people don't have it. They don't have this sanctification. These people mock what is holy. They do not participate in it. They do not bring others to it. This is a bad world. These are bad people. These are men who have tried to basically pull in every kind of bad conduct possible. Again, Romans 131 ties with this verse 3 almost exactly. One of the reasons is it's the first word here in verse 3 is that they're unloving. So since they're ungrateful and they're unholy, now they're also unloving. This word unloving only appears twice in Scripture. It appears here in Romans 1:31. So again, this directly ties it with vocabulary to the Romans 1 world. The King James here says, they're without natural affection. The newer translations say they're unloving. It's the word in Greek for a family love. There's multiple words in Greek for love. We know phileo and agape mostly, but there's also the eros. And then finally, there's the storgos. And the storgos love is the love of family. These people don't have that. So this word just says a storgos. It's the negative with the family love. They're lacking in love of family. And so we think about, some guys that are so bad that the only thing we can think nice of is, well, at least he loves his mom. Well, these guys don't love their mom, right? And maybe they had mothers that didn't love them. This is how bad off and how broken and how fractured this world is. The most basic of earthly relationships are sundered. They're disobedient to parents, and then we find they don't even have any love or respect for them or for their offspring. So they're irreconcilable. That last word again takes us to Romans 1. In Romans 1, with this in the same breath almost as unloving, is the ones who are covenant breakers, the ones who are unreliable. Here we have they're irreconcilable, or they're truce breakers. They don't hold to any oath or bond. And since we're talking about family with so much of this, what would be the bond? What would be the agreement, the covenant they made that these people would so likely and regularly break? Well, the marriage covenant, right? These people aren't loyal even to their spouse. They don't hold to their marriages. They're not faithful in their marriages. They're not faithful in agreements of any kind. It used to be said when I was younger, and I did used to be younger, much to the surprise of my children, but it used to be said when I was younger that when somebody was running for office and they were caught out with having an affair, or somebody was taking some other high position of responsibility and some kind of public trust, like, being the leader of some large sports organization or some large business organization, it used to be that it was a black mark on you that you had been unfaithful to your spouse or had been divorced. And people would say, well, if his wife can't trust him, how can we? I don't hear that argument being made much anymore. Nobody says that much anymore. And I wonder why. Is it because that strikes too close to home to too many? Is that because we just don't have any candidates at all that have been faithful to the first marriage that they contracted and made covenant over? Is it because people just don't see the connection anymore? But used to be you'd hear that. If his wife can't trust him, how can we? Well, you know what? We really probably can't. If it comes down to it, we really probably couldn't. But people don't seem to mind that if they can get the result they like. And so they'll go with the fellow who was irreconcilable, somebody who doesn't keep their covenants, their agreements of the past. Well, then we find they're malicious gossips. Again, it sounds like we're reading the paper, but we're talking about an ancient world. But we're talking about the world of Timothy from 2 millennia ago. But we've noted things have not much improved in this. There's nothing new under the sun. So malicious gossips, they're false accusers. Well, they don't keep covenant. They don't love anybody. They don't trust anybody. Nobody can trust them. So imagine what they might say about other people. Well, if it's false or not, if it's effective, that's fine. If it's malicious or not, it's okay. They'll say or do anything for the sake of gaining an advantage. Or sometimes, like mockers, they'll do it just for sport. They'll do it just to scoff. And so we find that they're gossips, but not just gossips, malicious ones. All right, then they're without self-control. I like the King James here using the old word incontinent. We now pretty much reserve the word incontinent for the lack of control of your physical body medically, usually for one or two conditions, right? But just imagine if we use this word incontinent all the time, or if humorously, the people who were morally incontinent, as it were, they had to wear their moral depends around, and we could tell as their moral depends filled up with the affluence of what was going on. But the old King James, incontinent, it means that they don't have control of themselves. Well, today we have a much more serious moral incontinence, a moral lack of self-control, where people cannot seem to deny themselves anything, no matter how perverse or how degraded. And then again, with that, we very much get to a Romans 1 world, and we see what is going on. And so we instead must practice righteousness and self-control, right? Acts 24:25, the preaching of the gospel to Felix was righteousness, self-control, and judgment. And the exhortation to the Corinthians, who of all the Christians probably needed it most, was Paul said, 1 Corinthians 9, that those who compete must exercise control in all things. They do it to get a perishable wreath, we an imperishable. Well, these people have no self-control. Well, if you have no self-control, what's going to be the result? The next is they're brutal. The King James says they're fierce. I noticed that in the last couple of years, fierce has become in some circles a bit of a compliment, that they talk about somebody being fierce. I'm not a fan of fierce people all that much. Of course, unless they wear the color of my sports team, then I'm hoping they're as fierce as possible. But no, a fierceness, a brutality. There's no mercy. There's no compassion. There's no reasoning with these people. They are brutal and beastly. They're haters of good. The King James says they despise those who do good. So they don't like good, and they don't like those who do it. They hate what is opposed to them. They hate those that practice what is opposed to them. Continuing on, we've got a bit to go. Verse 4. Again, these are some bad men. We got treacherousness, or the King James says they're traitors. So they'll betray confidence. They'll use what they know for their advantage. Does it hurt somebody else? Not terribly worried about it. They're reckless, or the King James says they're heady. They pursue their own plans. They want to do what they want to do. What if you warn them that, hey, there's going to be bad consequences for that? They don't care. What if you warn them, that's not right. That's not the way we do things right here. That's not kosher. No, they want to do what they want to do, because the next word, verse 4, they're conceited. Or the old King James again gives us high-minded. They think too much of themselves. That's kind of what, if there's one thing recurring on this list, it's some kind of high-mindedness, some kind of conceited, arrogant, thinking only of self. And then this next one is a description of that when it comes to sensual things. They are lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God. And so we think about Titus chapter 2. The grace of God has appeared, teaching us to deny ungodliness and worldly lust. Nope, not for these guys. ungodliness and worldly lust. That's what they're down for. That's what they're here for. That's some of their favorite things to do. They love pleasure more than God. Again, this Romans 1 type world. I think Paul is warning Timothy that this is going to be invading the church. I think that's why he says in the last times this perilous time will come, men will be. I think that it's already well established that this kind of world was going on outside the church, outside the hope in the Messiah. In the pagan world, all of this would have been no surprise. Why does Timothy need to be warned that pagans are going to pagan? Now, the problem for the church isn't when pagans going to pagan. The problem in the church is when Christians start to pagan. I think that's why the message is here. They love pleasure rather than they love more than they love God. It's like over in 2 Thessalonians when there's this great delusion that comes because men love pleasure more than truth, so as to cause the great falling away, and many follow after the son of perdition. So I think these things are invading and going to be invading the church. I think that's why we have this particularly long, again, Romans 1 type description of this to Timothy. When he saw this in the pagan marketplace, all right, well, that's sad. We're going to call these people from this. We're going to call them to God. But what do we have? What happens in the church when this shows up in the church? It's exactly contrary to Christ, the Spirit of Christ, the obedience of Christ, the example of Christ, the call of Christ. It's exactly opposite to it in every way. But I think we're in the church with all this and not the world because, verse 5, they hold a form of godliness but deny its power. See, the pagan world out there makes no pretense of godliness. They hate God and they'll say it. They ignore God and they're proud of it. They have nothing to do with God. The people herein described that cause peril for Timothy the preacher are the people who have a form of godliness, but none of the power. They claim positions that would appear even in the church, right? The men from your own selves will arise and speak perverse things, draw men after them. Paul said in Acts chapter 20. These people have places in the church. They're Diotrephes. They want to be first in the church. They put out the people who are true disciples in 3 John. They have a form of godliness. You know, the wolf is enough of a danger to the sheep, but the wolf in sheep's clothing is a far greater danger. And so in their claim to Christianity, in their speaking of the words of truth without the power of truth behind it, having it says here, denied the power of it, they are the great danger and the great peril, and they are, it says, to be avoided. Avoid these people. Same instruction as to the man who has his father's wife in 1 Corinthians 15. The same to those who walk disorderly among the Thessalonians. Those who flout the morality of that is taught in the church. Those who won't walk by the order of the church. Here, these who brought a Romans 1 world into the communion of Christ. These people need to be avoided. They need to be exposed. And that's why these people are going to cause such problems for Timothy. So we've got these bad men. Well, how would anybody fall for that? The next description in 2 verses is of weak women. So we had our bad men, and now they're preying on weak women. Isn't that always the case? Isn't that the world? Yeah. But it's a special trouble for us here in the church. When it's brought here, verse 6, for among them are those who enter into households. King James will very poetically say they creep in, right? Like the thief and the robber when Jesus talked about being the good shepherd. Those others weren't the shepherd. They didn't care for the sheep. They came to break in and steal. Well, now they're creeping in, right? Have you ever crept anywhere good? Have you ever done any good creeping? So here's some creeping into houses. What are they doing? They're captivating weak women. They captivate weak women. So it's some of the lady folks who fall for the flattery. It's the ladies who think these men in their wickedness are strong. And there's, an attraction to men who appear strong, especially among women who don't have the right priorities. They think that these fellas, in their success and their bluster, these fellas are the ones to follow. They captivate weak women. Why are they weak? They're weighed down by sin and they're led on by various impulses. Sin weighs us down. Sin weakens us. Sin makes us subject to additional sin. So these women in their sin, which they're not dealing with, in the imaginations of their own minds and their own impulses, these people are susceptible to these folks. We already know that they're people who'll say anything to gain an advantage. And so they go for these prime candidates for followers or for those who could be exploitable. Verse 7, these women, again, the weakness in them is they are always learning. So more facts, more things, but not able to come to a knowledge of the truth. And so there's no real discernment. There's no real conclusion to the teaching that strengthens them, that helps them. They hear, but they don't do. That's their sin. And their selfishness, being led on by various impulses, that's their lust. So there's continual hearing, but there's no bringing of maturity. There's no place for the teaching that they heard that stacks up into a hedge, to a bulwark, to any kind of defense against evil. It seems like the wilderness generation, they had the word preached to them, but it did not benefit them because it was not united by faith in those who heard. Well, these have heard, but it seems that the faith is lacking. And so what those people saw and heard didn't produce faith. The non-faith produced non-faithful fruits. Same with these. They've learned, but not discerned. And so they are susceptible to these bad men who come. Well, then Paul makes a very interesting statement that basically we have seen all of this before. And he uses the names of some people who are like this, men who were of absolute opposition to the truth, men who would lead others astray. Verse 8, just as Jannes and Jambres opposed Moses. What did Jannes and Jambres do? They opposed the truth. They were men of depraved mind. They were rejected in regard to the faith. Well, that's something I might want to know about. I'd like to go back in my Bible and read about these guys. And I get out my concordance and I look up Jannes and Jambres, and they're right there in the concordance in this verse. And they're not in the Old Testament. So what do I make of that? Well, it turns out that it was a common belief, both among Jews and then among Christians as well, many from a Jewish background, that they identified Jannes and Jambres as Egyptian magicians. So these were not of the people of God. It doesn't appear, but it was thought that they were the magicians of Egypt. There is a statement about the magicians of Egypt in Exodus 7. Moses and Aaron went to Pharaoh. Aaron cast down his staff. This is Exodus 7:10. And the staff became a serpent. Pharaoh summoned the wise men and the sorcerers, and they said, the magicians of Egypt did also the same by their magic arts. So each man cast down his staff, and they became serpents. But then Aaron won because his staff swallowed up theirs. But still, by that, Pharaoh's heart was hardened. So there was a couple of written texts so obscure and out of the way that they didn't even become part of the Apocrypha. And a couple of fragments of one of those texts has been found among the fragments of Egypt. A couple of I think there's one or two of those texts were found among the Dead Sea Scrolls, and then that was one of the two texts. And then it was mentioned by a couple of early church fathers as existing. There's another text purportedly of Solomon that also mentions these two characters by name. And so it seems to be this is a tradition of the Jews, in which many Christians also, as I say early on, accepted it, that among those magicians of Egypt were these two characters. Well, Paul seems to be referring to that pretty well-known story. I don't know that would mean the whole, everything ever written about him was true, but evidently the facts that these two men were among the Egyptians who helped harden Pharaoh's heart, that must have been true. And so Paul made reference to these well-known opponents of truth and gives them as the bad example to Timothy. We further find out about these that they did oppose the truth. They were of depraved mind. They were rejected as regard to faith. So they steered people away from faith. So just like the Elymas, the magician, did when the Apostle Paul was talking to the governor on Cyprus, they tried to stand opposed to the truth of God's word. And so Paul says the people that you're facing, Timothy, they're going to be just about that bad. They're going to be like these famous opponents of Moses. But there's a limit to how far this nonsense can go. Because if you try to bring too much of the pagan Romans one world into the church, there's only so many people going to accept it, right? There's going to be some bad men who are like that. There's going to be some weak women who follow that. But most of your audience, being made up of disciples of the Lord, they won't take to that. They'll see that for what it is. So verse 9, but they will make no further progress, for their folly will be obvious to all, just as Jannes and Jambres' was. All right, so in these perilous times, in these last days that people are going to come and make problems, Timothy, realize who's going to win. The Romans one world may invade the church for a bit, but it won't overcome it, right? The gates of hell will not prevail against the church that Jesus built. But also, there's only so far this ungodliness can go because we're dealing with a group of people trying to be godly. We're dealing with people called by the gospel, called to sanctification, called to holiness, called to be everything that these folks are not. And so, yes, they can always make some progress. You can always appeal to the bad character of bad people. But in the church, as an institution dedicated to be not that, but against that, Timothy realized it will be limited. So you're going to have some difficulties in the last days, but don't think that this is going to overcome. This is not going to win. All right. So with that, then, we'll move on next time to further instructions about what's coming and how Timothy is to faithfully deal with all of these things.